David Graizbord and I have put our heads together for quite some time and concocted sort of this symposium. And we want to address this, of course, from an academic standpoint, scholarly standpoint, but at the same time, we've also come, I think, from a personal concern. We need to address certain things. And we were then funded by a grant from AEN, an organization that tries to promote, I would say, tolerance and fighting against anti-Semitism. We all know what that term means. We are trying to provide a little bit historical perspective. I myself, belonging to late antiquity, Middle Ages, and early modern times, but I will couch this in a very contemporary context a little bit. David Graizbord will pick up late antiquity because we lost a colleague who would have addressed the early history, and then take us to the early modern times. My colleague, Tom Kovach, Professor Emeritus of German Studies, will then take us to the late 19th and 20th century. And our keynote speaker afterwards will then give us, the keynote lecture, and I just will let him address these issues. And then turn over quickly to David Graizbord to say a word of welcome.
Thank you all for being here and for your patience. I really like to apologize for the technical difficulties over which, unfortunately, I have no real control since I'm not computer savvy. There's, I think, a very widespread public perception that people who express bigotry towards Jews are people who are uncouth and uneducated, unenlightened. This conference is partly to question that notion, and specifically to explore manifestations of anti-Jewish hatred, not all of which can be categorized as anti-Semitism properly. Explore manifestations of this hatred in elite circles, intellectual circles, often associated with academia, with modern academia, sometimes not. I look forward to a productive discussion. So now I turn it over to my colleague.
Yeah. So thank you very much. And I would like also to emphasize before we start, this is the result of what you kind of dream of in the university, interdisciplinary exchange and shared research, even though we come from different areas, but we meet in the middle and hope to be able to present to you a variety of different perspectives. So I have a PowerPoint.
Yes.
Maybe we can start with that.
Well, if I'm going to do Antiquity, I'll start with Antiquity. If that's
Why
okay.
don't you do that, Dave?
Okay.
That's very good. Yes.
All right. Now I have to open my PowerPoint.
Minimize that maybe, and then you can open up the PowerPoint. Escape, click on escape.
Okay, there we are.
Find it.
I don't know why it suddenly is closed. All right, this is a comedy of errors or a tragedy of errors.
Well, while he's addressing this,
here we have.
There we
Here
go.
we have two panelists. Okay.
The video works. All right.
All right.
Okay, something.
thank you.
Okay,
Gentlemen.
so. Okay, late antiquity covers the period of Greek hegemony over the Mediterranean and continues through the period of Roman control. In this very long, centuries-long period, a number of anti-Jewish motifs emerged. They were fundamentally directed at a Jewish collectivity by intellectuals, literate people, people who usually wrote in Greek. They included historians, philosophers, polemicists of various stripes. The motifs may be summarized as follows. Jews and Judaism are not an ancient people. Therefore, they're not a legitimate people. They're not even therefore respectable. One claim that was formulated to support this view is that the Exodus story of the Bible is a pious fiction, and that in fact the Israelites who escaped bondage from Egypt were a colony of lepers whom the Pharaoh expelled. A second claim is that the radical monotheism that the Judeans subscribed to was anomalous, bizarre, if somewhat alluring for its weirdness. A third claim was that Jews, in fact, sacrifice human beings, especially non-Judeans, in their temple in Jerusalem. A fourth claim is that Jews are lazy, and evidence of this included the canard that the Sabbath, according to, for example, Juvenal from one of his satires, the Sabbath was an excuse not to engage in productive work. A fifth claim is that Jews are a barbarous people, and evidence or supposed evidence for this was the very common Near Eastern, also Judean ritual of circumcision of males. A sixth claim is that the Jews' way of life is by itself absurd, and various Hellenized or Hellenic writers offered Jewish dietary law and other purity laws as supposed evidence of this. The bottom line is that Jews are somehow antisocial, if not actually misanthropic, that is, that they hate humanity. An example of this, this approach comes from the writing of Philostratus, a sophist of the Roman era, nonetheless a Greek. He wrote as follows, quote, "The Jews have been long in revolt against humanity, a nation that has made its own a life apart and irreconcilable, that cannot share with the rest of mankind in the pleasures of the table, nor join in their libations or prayers and sacrifices, are separated from ourselves, the Hellenized, by a greater gulf than divides us from Susa or Bactra or from the more distant regions." Okay, so these canards I submit are present, albeit in modified form, and even some contemporary accusations that Jews have had to, with which Jews have had to contend. For a discussion of the Middle Ages, I'd like to invite my colleague, Albrecht Classen. I will open his PowerPoint, because I'm sure his, okay. Okay.
And we switch the seats. Okay. Yeah. All right. My topic is the history of anti-Semitism from late antiquity to the early modern age. Let me enlarge this a little bit to make it look better. There we go. Okay, very good. I want to begin with embedding the history of medieval, early modern anti-Semitism actually in the modern context. It is almost serendipitous that we have the topic, the conference today, this week, or maybe this month. If you follow the news, there have been major issues reported both from Europe as well as from the United States, from the public outside of the academy and within. And so I would like just to embed this topic in the current issue. I would like to emphasize that anti-Semitism is alive and well, and I just bring it down to a very local history. You might have heard we have a local Hotel Congress, and they organized a kind of a country music concert or so, and it was supposed to be with Chuck Wagon and the Wheels. Not that I know anything about this music or this band, but there were some kind of shock waves that went through Tucson because they found out that one of the lead performers, Chuck Maltzby, he is the titular head of the Chuck Wagon, and it turned out that he's an extreme anti-Semite and somebody who denies Holocaust and all kinds of other horrible things. Fortunately, Hotel Congress then has blocked it. I think he uninvited the whole band. But as you can see, Arizona Daily Star, April 15, that's the headline. This group has been yanked from the concert lineup because of the anti-Semitic comments and statements. So it is right with us, around us, and other examples. Here's a picture of him. I don't want to spend too much time on him, but I wanted to quote also somebody from the art scene here in town, Michael Schwartz, who responded to my public announcement of our conference on Facebook. And here is a quote from him. Looks amazing. Anti-Semitism in the Tucson arts scene, he's an artist, is rampant, unchecked, but very well documented. Those of us who tried to speak up were canceled. How representative that is, I don't know. That is just one voice I got in response to our call for topics. Then also, if you go through town, anywhere, you find these posters and flyers, really, or boards, namely identifying Israel as an apartheid state, which is not just something on the flippant side, but rather, as you will see in a second, this is a result of a global effort right now. I would say this is a very toxic charge that's really what we are trying to look at, which then ultimately also bleeds into the academic discourse. And that's why we need to discuss it. This is a report that just came out last week. That is Amnesty International. I have great respect for Amnesty International, certainly, but they are now fully on the side of those who claim that Israel is an apartheid state. That might be or might not be. This is not the issue for our conference, but I have heard a lot of comments, rumblings here and there when we tried to talk about the academic side and the historical side that immediately became political. And I want to emphasize, well, first of all, here a couple of comments I found online. Major representatives of various governments have extremely protested against this statement by Amnesty International. And I just leave it at that because I don't want to become too political, because our topic does not concern really, concern Israel or the situation in Israel or the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. That is one topic, a very politically charged topic. What we are concerned with is very simply what is happening here and how do we understand the historical background of our topic. So I want to look at anti-Semitism in a global context. And I stay a little bit more in the current situation. These are reports from just a few days ago and today. In Germany alone, for example, that's the FAZ, the FAZ, Frankfurter Allgemeine, one of the major newspapers in Germany, and they reported here, you can see the figures, in 2021 alone, there were about 2,300 criminal acts based on anti-Semitism, more than ever before, since the Second World War, of course. This is really shocking. The records were taken starting in 2001, but the situation is exactly the same. Department of Justice, here in reports that last year, the number of reports of anti-Semitic violence decreased by 452 since 2019, but the overall number of reported incidents increased by 949. So a total of 8,263 cases of hate crime against Jews, synagogues, you name it, or organizations. And this is just a link so that you know where I got this from. Now, and this is the anti-Semitic reports. This also from the kind of same figures confirms that as well, which was reported this morning in our Daily Star. It was kind of interesting how seminal it is. We want to approach it from a historical perspective, but it stares right into our face when we open the newspapers. And so I think there's a great concern and need. Now, beginning with my historical overview or reflections, one thing is extremely important and difficult. Of course, Jews have experienced their diaspora, forced by the Romans out of their homeland, if you will, and have lived ever since in diaspora. That is always a cause of conflict and strife and tensions. So wherever Jews were forced to live or to move to, that caused always conflict, has always caused conflicts. And I will sort of reflect then on the historical issue. Christianity became basically a state religion in the Roman Empire in 380. And it's sort of the irony of Christianity. They were persecuted until then, more or less. And as soon as they gained power, or except as the state religion, they turned around and committed the same kind of crimes against the Jews, for example, as have been committed against them. So late antiquity is in a very odd situation, but that's a result of the diaspora. I just leave that for you a little bit. This is, however, very important, where the academy suddenly comes in. There are two different things. Maybe start with the bottom bullet point. The MLA is the biggest organization for Modern Language Association of America. And we have once a year a huge conference with about 10,000 people. All modern languages are involved. And for the last 5 or 6 years, there has been a very strong faction in the MLA, graduate students, professors, whatever, who have tried to boycott Israeli scholars from that conference, I would say as a measure of collective guilt in protest against, let's say, land settlements in Israel. Also, this group of people tried to boycott all Israeli scholars, putting them into the same pocket as those who maybe were responsible for land settlements. A very problematic approach. And now we have a new situation right now within the academy. And that's a very political thing. I don't want necessarily to get involved, but I just present it to you. The Middle East Studies Association has endorsed and implemented a boycott, a divestment, and sanctions resolution against Israel in its universities. So whether you are an Israeli scholar fighting for the freedom and liberation of Palestinians or not, you are put into the same part of collective guilt. So I'm not quite sure if we had representatives of MESA here, they might argue very differently, but the political strife is now right with us. We can no longer simply keep a blind eye. We know that this is an issue that affects all of us. And why is this also? So let me just talk briefly about some of the medieval aspects. This is a quick, rough map. The distribution of Jewish settlements, which of course left basically the Palestine and spread all over northern Africa, then Spain, modern day France. They moved into many different areas where there had never been Jews. And England is a particularly fascinating example. Jews came to England only with William the Conqueror, with the Anglo-Normans. And they were brought in sort of as the tax collectors. So the new aristocrats needed to have a group of people who served that specific purpose, namely to extract the money from the Anglo-Saxons. And so naturally, Jews became right away the main target of criticism and hatred because they were those who collected money and people didn't like to pay money. So whenever the ruler needed more money for his wars, he pressured the Jews to pay him more, so they had to go to the ordinary people, and that led then, of course, to the natural hostility, which ultimately then went to 1219, when then the English crown finally expelled all of Jews. Why? The English king had refused to let this happen for almost a decade or more, because he needed the Jews as creditors. Most members of the parliament, however, were so deeply indebted to Jewish bankers that they wanted to have the usual strategy, just expel all Jews. And in 1290, the king himself saw himself so deeply indebted to Jews, and he needed to get rid of his debt. And instead of paying, he just ordered the ban of all Jews. And that led to the complete expulsion of Jews from England. Very convenient, you just expel them, hence all your debt is suddenly done. That is the situation of England, and that's the date. And here, 4 of the major charges against Jews. I need actually to begin with one church council, 1215, the 4th Lateran Council, at which the church decided 2 or 3 major things relevant for our purposes. One was that every Christian had to confess at least once a year. And secondly, they declared that during their Eucharist, their celebration, the wafer was not simply a symbol, but became God's or Christ's own body. That wafer, hence, became subsequently an object which Christians and Jews fought over, because, in the sense that Christians suddenly used a charge which we call the host desecration. Whenever the Christian population needed to get rid of their debt or fight against Jews, they normally planted some kind of a host, stole it maybe from a priest, and threw it in the front of a house of a Jew, and then the mob could be incited, and they said, see, the Jews have done it once again, they're trying to kill our Messiah. And then we have mass killings, and that was a very effective tool. The other one is, of course, killing of Christ. Jews were always accused of having killed the Messiah. Much more absurd was the so-called blood libel, the charge, I think, David, you referred to that just a little bit, the charge that Jews needed to clean themselves ritually, but they needed to use blood, the blood of an innocent Christian child. And this became a very pervasive charge all over medieval and early modern Europe. I would say whenever there might have been a murder of a child, people could not solve the crime. That happens even until today. Then there was always the charge, well, the Jews must have done it. And thirdly, usury. So Jews were always those who were limited to handling money. They were normally regarded as the only money lenders, which, however, is, as we find out right now, not really quite true. And since their only business was to make money through lending money, taking interest, which already Augustine and all the other church fathers had condemned very vehemently, they had no understanding of modern finance, and they didn't understand how great the need there was for credit for your money. So there was always then the vehement charge, Jews are usurers and therefore to be condemned. This goes on throughout the centuries, particularly in the 13th and 14th centuries, when really Christian bankers come up, particularly in Italy, and big banking houses, southern Germany, England, France, and northern Italy. And they used this charge against Jews. You're just usurers. You're evil. You do bad things, when they themselves did the big business. So Christian bankers increasingly handled the huge financial aspects, namely lending billions of dollars to the kings or whatever other rulers. The Jewish bankers, they handled normally smaller credits to the farmers or craftsmen, and they were basically their neighbors. So the hatred could really infect this whole thing much, much more. I did a study last year, which was published since then, about when did this charge of usury start, and I could discover that this really does not begin until the 14th century, namely in the time of COVID-19, I mean, the Black Death. So the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, more or less, and then many repeated stages. Whenever there's time of crisis and stress, then people are looking for alternatives, and not alternatives, they're looking for scapegoats. And ever since Jews were then increasingly victims of those charges, namely, oh, they do host desecration, they do blood libel, and they are horrible usurers. When in reality, the biggest lenders were Christian merchants. And so that is kind of a summary. I just want to rush through a little bit more. You can see these things. Maybe the last part, one point is also interesting. I think Christians tended to be jealous of Jews because Christians, on the average, throughout the early modern era, were more or less more limited. They were more parochial. They only spoke their vernacular. Maybe if they were learned, they spoke Latin. Jews were always A, multilingual, and B, they were international travelers, many times global players. Jews traded from Western Spain to Baghdad, from northern Scandinavia to Byzantine countries, from northern Africa to northern England. So they roamed the world. So very naturally, the Christian population, very parochial in their cities or villages, saw the Jews as a challenge they did not like. And I skipped this, and then just kind of have the summary here. There we have continuous expulsions of Jews in England, 1290, France twice, in Spain, then finally in 1492. And Jews were tolerated or were welcomed both in Flanders, the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, Poland, and then the Ottoman Empire, and to some extent also in Italy. This is the Black Death. I just skip this and end up with the early modern time, the Protestant Reformation. And if you think about Martin Luther, or Luther as we say in English, who in his early years, still 1521, expressed a number of times rather optimistic, positive, almost tolerant opinions about Jews. But in the course of time, and I have a list here, he became increasingly and more and more aggressively hostile against Jews and formulated enormously ugly statements against Jews, which resulted ultimately in this iconographic motif is called the Judensau. So pigs are, of course, anathema to Jews, and Christian sculptors and artists all over Germany, by the way, primarily Germany, but also Italy, created this image. These are publicly displayed until today, showing Jews either licking the sows behind or sucking milk from its teats, sort of presenting Jews in the most demeaning fashion possible. So this is, interesting enough, in Wittenberg, sort of the result of Luther's propaganda against Jews. And only last year, somebody tried to sue that this should be removed because it's an insult to Jews. The man lost that suit because the court decided it is an historical monument. We have a plaque explaining this, and hence it has to stay. So you can see why maybe anti-Semitism continues. And what I've tried to do, this is my last slide. Here you have the roots, and you have many different major aspects leading to the continuation of those stereotypes. That is the creepy thing about those prejudices and stereotypes. They might go under the carpet and disappear for a while, and they always come creeping up once again. And so those who formulate anti-Semitic statements have simply available an incredibly effective reservoir of stereotypes and prejudice against Jews, and it has not changed much in any way. So fortunately, I must say, I think in our setting, normally, at least in my classes, I don't witness anything of that sort. I myself have never heard any student formulating any anti-Semitic statements, so I feel very fortunate in that regard. But at the same time, as I told you, I have been exposed to the heavy charges in the MLA, that is my professional organization, with a very, very strong, vehement movement trying to boycott all Israeli scholars. That means our discussion about the history of anti-Semitism has its roots, and these roots are not going away, but rather they are just virulent and continue to exert its influence. I think, and on this note, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And David, that would be then you next.
Thank you, Professor Classen. I would like to set the stage for what my colleagues, Professor Kovach and Professor Herf, are going to say in a moment. So let me briefly deal with some of the developments that affected that, you might say, that reconstructed anti-Jewish animus in the early modern centuries. By early modern, historians usually mean, well, they mean a number of things, but usually we're talking here about the 15th through the early 18th, or maybe even late 18th centuries. Please bear with me as I try to reopen and project my PowerPoint. By the way, several of the, in fact, most of the phenomena, the medieval phenomena that Professor Classen has mentioned, usually are discussed by scholars under the rubric of what the historian Jeremy Cohen has called anti-Judaism. By anti-Judaism, Jeremy Cohen and others mean an ideology according to which Jews constitute not simply a group that is other, that is somehow blind and impervious to the truth that God has revealed to the earth, but rather that Jews constitute a hostile and dangerous minority, that their otherness is actually harmful to Christians and therefore to the spiritual state of Christendom. Just a technical check. Folks, tell me if this is visible to the online people.
Yes, it is.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to move ahead. Okay. So again, several of the phenomena that Professor Classen mentioned are what historians call anti-Jewish phenomena. There are a couple, however, a couple of these phenomena that grew out of the Middle Ages and that really became prominent in the early modern period. I'm going to focus on two of them. One is the phenomenon of ghettoization, right here with the cursor. The other one is the rather interesting mutation of anti-Jewish animus that occurred in the Iberian Peninsula from the 14th century onward. In Spain and Portugal, anti-Judaism took on a particularly virulent form, but this was, perhaps not surprisingly, a form of hatred that was spearheaded by intellectuals, by people who knew not only how to read, but who were learned in Christian theology. One of them was a fellow by the name of Ferran Martinez. He was an archdeacon in the city of Seville. like many other anti-Jewish clergymen, he agitated in the street corners of Seville against the Jewish presence, and very much pursued the anti-Jewish objective of having the Jews convert to Christianity rather than remain you might say, a barely tolerated minority. As a result of his preaching, a series of anti-Jewish riots spread like wildfire, to use a cliche, throughout the Iberian, specifically the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. One result of these riots was the conversion, often by force, of about 2/3 of the Castilian and Aragonese Jewish populations. This gave rise to the problem of conversos, converts, or new Christians, cristianos nuevos. Sorry about the typos there. Conversos were essentially people who had converted under duress from Judaism and were Christians, qualified or entitled to all the social, economic, and cultural privileges of other Christians. In time, however, I would say that anti-Jewish polemicists and their allies became victims of their own success, so much so that they refrained from accepting conversos as brethren in the church. That's why not only the converts themselves, but the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren of the converts were also called conversos, converts, or new Christians. To use a term like converso or new Christian, or even the pejorative marrano, which means swine, was essentially to convey the notion that a person of Jewish ancestry was by definition an insincere and bad Christian. So we have, as of 1391, a very new situation where people who are identified socially as Jews are no longer other. They are at least technically the same as their neighbors, their Christian neighbors. This sameness gives rise among many Christian Castilians and Aragonese to the notion that it is not the Jews' culture that is somehow dangerous. There's only the culture that is dangerous to Christendom, the culture of the Jews, but rather their blood, right? Their descent. The notion arises specifically that blood completely determines a person's character. So no matter how respectable a person might be, no matter how disciplined a Christian that person might be, his or her ancestry, especially any ancestry from the Jewish communities or from the Muslim communities, predispose that person to be a destructive Christian, a false Christian. So I have here the last bullet. The term that is most commonly associated with this way of thinking that I've just outlined is limpieza de sangre, cleanness of blood, sometimes translated as purity of blood. Now, it bears mentioning that Christian dogma on neophytes, so on people who adopt the Christian religion, has it that if a person becomes baptized and is baptized in a way that can be interpreted as voluntary, then that person is, for all intents and purposes, a proper Christian, one whose spirit enjoys the protection of the church. However, this very traditional notion was, I think, rejected in practice in both Castile and Aragon, and eventually in Portugal and Navarre as well. From the 1500s onward, in particular, new Christians developed a social profile, which I think many scholars have started to treat as ethnic. In other words, regardless of their actual theological beliefs and their religious behavior, conversos saw each other, and they were viewed by non-conversos as part of a separate ethnic group. So here, the source of tension, the source of anti-Jewish animus, is not the otherness or the cultural difference of Jews, but rather their sameness and the notion that conversos are, in essence, a dangerous element that has infiltrated a spiritually healthy community. Anti-converso agitators from the 1500s onward pursued two primary goals. The first was to introduce a centralized religious or system of religious tribunals to pursue what the church for very long had called Judaizing. Judaizing essentially means behaving or believing what the church said that Jews believed, and however the church defined Jewish behavior. Now, sometimes let's say the Roman Church's notion of what it meant to be a Jew differed rather significantly from what Jews actually did and how Jews conceived of themselves. Nevertheless, this Pauline idea of Judaizing, that is to say St. Paul's notion of Judaizing, became the dominant, let's say, accusation that Iberian polemicists and agitators and eventually inquisitors leveled at conversos. In 1478, a unified Spanish Inquisition was indeed approved at the papal level. This was a body that was in effect and for all intents and purposes controlled by the Castilian and Aragonese crowns. The second major purpose or goal of anti-converso agitators in the early modern period was to expel the Jews from Castile and Aragon, in fact, the entire Iberian Peninsula, so that, this was the argument, so that the new Christians, be they first generation, second generation, third generation, or what have you, could be properly Christianized without the interference of people who still retained a Jewish identification. In other words, people who had not converted were reputed to be preventing conversos from becoming good Christians. So in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and the last vestiges of Muslim political power was ended in the Iberian Peninsula, or were ended in the Iberian Peninsula, the Jewish populations of Castile and Aragon were formally and thoroughly expelled. I'm talking here about unconverted Jews. In 1497, the Portuguese crown came under Castilian pressure, and the king there issued his own, the king of Portugal issued his own expulsion decree, but rather than actually expel Jews, what he did was he herded them into cathedrals, into hangars, into public spaces, and have them cursorily baptized. So from morning to night, so to speak, there was a new population of, in this case, Portuguese new Christians who were subject to the same mistrust as their Castilian counterparts. In 1498, the kingdom of Navarre, a small kingdom that eventually was swallowed up by the crown of Aragon in what is now northern Spain, it too expelled its Jewish population, so that by 1500, there were no more Jews, at least not officially, in the Iberian Peninsula. That is to say, no more people who professed openly and proudly anything like Jewish culture. What we had were several populations of so-called new Christians. Some were actual converts, others were not, who were, let's say, laboring under the blanket imputation that they were indeed bad Christians, prone to destroying whatever good Christians built. Here are two definitions of cleanness of blood, which become, I would say, intertwined with inquisitorial persecution throughout the early modern centuries. The first is from a fellow by the name of Martinez de Toledo. He wrote as follows in 1438. Take two sons, one the child of a laborer and the other of a knight. Rear them in a mountain under the rule of discipline of a husband and wife. You will see how the son of the laborer will be pleased by the activities of village life, such as plowing, digging and bringing firewood with beasts of burden. And the son of a knight is not satisfied unless he is out running and galloping, running on a galloping horse, bearing weapons and going around stabbing, and goes around too tired for work. This is what nature proffers. You will see this each day wherever you live, that the good one of good race still carries or falls back on where he comes from, and the graceless of vile races and lineage, however great he may be and however much he may possess, will never fall back, but on the vileness from which he descends, end quote. So notice, this is not an attack on Jews as a pernicious race. This is a broader statement about the supposed, let's say, the moral and behavioral effects of one's ancestry. So if you come from laborers, you are a laborer, even if you dress in fine clothes. If you are a gentleman, you are a gentleman internally, and by virtue of your ethics, no matter whether you actually possess weaponry or horses or an estate or what have you. So notice here the early modern notion of raza, which, by the way, race that's where the English word race comes from, enters discourse on human difference, and especially becomes a weapon in the persecution of conversos as somehow secret, quote unquote, secret Jews. Okay, the second second definition I'd like to read from you is from a polemical tract by the very learned Francisco de Torrejoncillos. He wrote something called Centinela contra Judíos. This is a kind of sentinel against the Jews. So notice, the work is intended as an explicitly anti-Jewish, let's say, propaganda piece, right? But here, Torrejoncillos is actually attacking not just openly professing unconverted Jews, but conversos as well. Here's how he talks about purity of blood. To be the enemy of Christians, it is not necessary for both one's father and mother to be Jews. One parent alone suffices. It is irrelevant if the father is Jewish. The mother alone is enough. And she does not have to be wholly Jewish. Half Jewish is enough. And even 1/4 or 1/8. In our days, the Inquisition has found that even if people are 21 degrees removed from Jewish ancestors, they are known to Judaize. Okay, so notice the very explicit connection, or you might say equation, or virtual equation of ancestry and alleged behavior. Okay, to wrap up discussion of the early modern period, let me point out a number of additional factors. When the Jews, not the conversos, but the Jews of Castile and Aragon were expelled, they were the last in a long line of Jewish communities that had been expelled fundamentally from Western Europe. By 1500, there were officially no Jews in France, Spain, Portugal, England, and many other places. However, there were many Jews who were formally readmitted to various territories from which their ancestors had been expelled from the late 1500s onward. Many times, these readmitted Jews were people who were in one way or another participating in nascent Western capitalism. In other words, they handled money and they invested money. Often these were the self-same descendants of the people that Albrecht Classen mentioned, namely usurers, people who provided very small time loans to very small people, artisans, laborers, etc. Now, a few of these folks were actually prominent, for example, in funding the military ventures and the state institutions of princelings in, let's say, in the cities of Central Europe. Precisely at a time when these princelings were, let's say, employing Jews as their main court factors, as their main financial backers, and sometimes political advisors, the Protestant Reformation was well underway. Protestant thinkers tried, of course, to distance themselves from what at that point came to be known as the Catholic Church, the Roman Church. However, they relied for their diatribes on Jews on a series of rather old canards, old motifs of anti-Jewish animus, particularly the notion that Jews are somehow materialistic, that they cannot appreciate or somehow benefit from the purely spiritual, from the abstract, and are you might say fixated on the finite, on the physical, and the literal. The Protestant preachers were often, accessories at the very least of local expulsions of Jews when they preached, for example, that Jews were exploiting the peasantry by offering small loans or what have you. In some cases, local persecutions of Jews, especially in the Protestant territories, were balanced out, or you might say canceled, by raison d'état, that is to say, by reasons of state, by rulers or their bureaucracies, which supported the activities of Jews, if not Jewish culture itself, and therefore prevented Jews from being irrevocably expelled or killed outright. All the same, Protestant thinking, Protestant theology, Protestant, let's say, political discourse tended to assail Jews as somehow related to the hated Catholic enemy. So, for example, a number of friars who had been Jews in their youth, number of Catholic friars, Franciscans, Dominicans, what have you, were attacked by Protestant preachers as essentially Jews and wrong on Christian grounds because they were somehow unable to overcome, these friars were supposedly unable to overcome their Jewishness, their Jewish blood, if you will. Here's a touch of Martin Luther's invective against the Jews. And I put the Jews between quotation marks because ultimately what we're talking about in the Lutheran imagination here is not Jews of flesh and blood, but rather figural entities. And so, dear Christians, or dear Christian, he wrote, beware of the Jews. You can see how God's wrath has consigned them to the devil, who has robbed them not only of a proper understanding of the scriptures, but also of common human reason, modesty, and sense. Thus, when you see a real Jew, you may with good conscience cross yourself and boldly say, there goes the devil incarnate, end quote. I'm not going to read the rest. Suffice it to say that toward the end of his life, Luther proposed, or you might say prescribed, that Jews be pastoralized. In other words, that they be that their synagogues be destroyed, that they be essentially forced to work on the land, and thereby become, as it were, subservient to a properly configured Christian community. Okay, I would like to now invite my colleague Tom Kovach to take us into the modern era. Tom Kovach is as you've seen in our publicity, he is a scholar of modern literature. So I expect that he will focus on that subject.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Let me just make sure that you are visible to all. Here we go. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay.
Okay.
There you are.
Thank you. And I will try to keep this fairly brief to leave time for Professor Herf. But now you've brought us into the late 18th century, which is where I'd like to begin. If we look at the history of Jews in Europe from the late 18th century into the 20th century, one pattern that emerges that I find kind of perplexing is that we have a great breakthrough and it's followed by a big turn in the other direction, usually a rise of anti-Jewish hatred. But to just look at some of that history, until the late 18th century, Jews not only were regarded by the Gentile world, but regarded themselves as a separate people. There was really no notion that they were part of the larger nation. But things began to change, and one huge figure in this respect is the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, who was a devout Orthodox Jew, but at the same time was one of the leading German philosophers of the Enlightenment. And he was really an example to all that you could be a Jew and you could participate in European culture. You could be a German in this case. And of course, his legacy was followed right away by the French Revolution and the granting of equal rights of citizenship to Jews in France, which was a first in European history. And so here you could say, okay, this is a great moment for the Jews in Europe. But guess what? Things didn't turn out that well. Because, of course, with the rise of Napoleon, who takes his armies across much of Europe and imposes French law all over, especially in the German-speaking lands, you had a great rise of resentment against this kind of imposition, at a time when most Germans were not ready to grant rights of citizenship to Jews, but they were forced to do so. And this caused a great rise of resentment. And in the German-speaking world, of course, the additional complexity is that unlike other European countries like France, England, Spain, which had had fairly well-established national identities for a while, the Germans, which of course were citizens of many states, were struggling to find some kind of a national identity. And in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, this was kind of defined in ways that were, first of all, very misogynist, but also very anti-Semitic. That to be a German, you had to be a Christian male, basically. And so, now with the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 and the so-called Reconstruction era, we see a lot of kind of back and forth. And one thing that's interesting, and I won't be talking about literature a lot, but I find it very intriguing that if you look at some of the really dominant literary texts in German in the 19th century, perhaps two of the most ambiguous ones, or some would even say the two most ambiguous ones, are both centered on Jewish themes or Jewish characters. One is by the woman writer Annette von Droste-Hülshoff, called Die Judenbuche, or the Jews' Beech Tree. And it is entirely ambiguous. Now, the interpretations of that tale range from those who say this is a really denunciation of prejudice. On the other hand, we've seen a very persuasive recent interpretation that says this is radically anti-Semitic, that shows really is about the infiltration of Jews into German blood. You can't even get a unanimity in terms of what really happens in this text. So it is really fascinating and perplexing text. Another is by the Austrian writer Adalbert Stifter, called Abdias, which is about an African Jew who is forced to emigrate and comes to Europe. And it's very hard to really pin down because there are positive aspects, but then we see a lot of negative aspects in this character too. And so it's very hard to know how his Jewishness is being portrayed. Interestingly, both of these texts appeared in 1842, just before the year of the revolution, the 1848 revolutions, which were mostly overturned after those brief uprisings. And, what was interesting is you saw a kind of, until this time, a kind of alliance of more nationalistic and more liberal kind of movements. But then after that, the two sort of went their separate ways. And then, of course, in the 1870 era, we see in both Germany and then in Austria and then in Germany, we see the granting of rights to Jewish citizens. And then, of course, following the pattern I mentioned before, we see there was a huge stock market crash and a huge economic crisis. And of course, who would be the scapegoat? It was the Jews. And so you see a rise of anti-Semitism. And now the word anti-Semitism, of course, is something to discuss here because this was something that was really formulated only around this time, in 1879 and 1880, two works by the German journalist Wilhelm Marr, one that talked about the way to victory of the Germanic spirit over the Jewish spirit, which followed after the victory of the Jewish spirit over the Germanic spirit. Now, what is going on here, and where does this term anti-Semitism come from? Well, what's interesting is that we see these thinkers who are trying to distance themselves from this kind of very more old school anti-religious, religiously based anti-Judaism. And they wanted no part of that. So basically they're talking about Jews as a race. And this is where we really begin, although I think it's been shown that this is not totally new, but this becomes a really dominant feature in the discourse about Jews, that they are a different race. And so this whole notion of anti-Semitism, and one of the ironies here is the term Semitic, as you may know, includes Arabs as well as Jews. Especially in a modern perspective, it's a little ironic to be using this term. But we are kind of stuck with it. I mean, if I could sort of wave a magic wand and sort of totally eliminate that term from our discourse, I think I would, because it is so misleading, but it remains there. And interestingly enough, a Jewish historian recently, 20 years or so, wrote a very short piece talking about how we really should not hyphenate that word. The notion of using a hyphen and then saying anti and then capital S Semitism is really misleading. And so he's really arguing for using it all as one word, which I do. But then, of course, when I type in Microsoft Word, it always tells me, no, that's a misspelling. But anyway. Just another example of this kind of new sort of modern kind of progressive-minded anti-Semitism is a historian, Heinrich von Trijcke, and just a quote from one of his works: "The Jews at one time played a necessary role in German history because of their ability in the management of money. But now that the Aryans have become accustomed to the idiosyncrasies of finance, the Jews are no longer necessary. The international Jew, hidden in the mask of different nationalities, is a disintegrating influence. He can be of no further use to the world." So again, we have this notion that Jews are incapable of joining another national group. And he is the author of the phrase, "Die Juden sind unser Unglück," the Jews are our misfortune, which became one of the main slogans in Nazism, especially a particularly prominent Nazi journal. So just try to speak very, very quickly about now the rise of anti-Semitism, again around the around 1900. We talked about that. And of course, interestingly enough, France had been looked at as the sort of epitome of progressivism, of tolerance of different groups. But then what do we have in the 1890s? The Dreyfus Affair in France, where this French military officer is accused of treason, of spying for the Germans, is put in a desert island. And then although he is exonerated a few years later, this kind of rise of anti-Semitism in France did not really die down. So this is the sort of situation we're in, and this is one of the bases for the rise of the new Zionist movement, which is founded by the Viennese Jew, Herzl. And one of the ironic things is that Theodor Herzl was the epitome of the assimilated Jew, but he finally reached the conclusion that Jews really had no chance. And then just one more comment to point out, after World War I, the defeat of Germany and Austria, in the first German democracy, the Weimar Republic, we see a huge rise of Jewish participation in all levels of society, in the arts and in politics. And at a time when it would have been unthinkable to have a Jewish Secretary of State in the US, There was a secretary, there was a foreign secretary in the Weimar Republic, Walter Rathenau. Good news. And then, of course, 4 months after his appointment, he is assassinated. So I don't think I have to tell you what comes after the Weimar Republic, that we all know that far too well. So I think there are so many more things to say, but at this point, I'd really like to turn the floor over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom Kovach. It strikes me that several of the people on whose thought you focused were very educated folk, unlike, let's say, the assassins of Walter Rathenau, who were, you might say, street thugs or street-level anti-Semites. You know, there is, I dare say, a genteel form, or there are many genteel forms of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish animus of other kinds. With that said, let me introduce Professor Herf, who has had the good sense to allow us to work our technical difficulties out. And now I'm eager to hear him bring us up to date with a discussion of truth and lies in modern academia that may be at least accessory to anti-Jewish animosity.
May I ask whether we might want to entertain some questions first?
Can't hear you.
Well, my colleague asked whether there
Yes,
are any
there.
questions.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Yes.
can hear you. I'm going to let you move forward, and let's just advise our audience to, if you're online, to write your questions in the chat or Q&A segment of the Zoom room. Those of you here can please hold your peace until Professor Herf has finished.
Thank you, Professor Graizbord. Thank you, all of you, for inviting me to participate in what is already a very rich and interesting discussion. I think I'll speak for a little over 30 minutes, but I could summarize the core issue that I'm raising is what is the relationship between past and present. So I'll just plunge into the talk now. To the extent to which anti-Semitism, and I share Professor Kovach's reservation about the term, to the extent to which anti-Semitism actually applies to sentiments within the European and American Academy in the past 2 decades, it concerns efforts supported by radical Islamist groups and secular leftists to attack the legitimacy of the state of Israel and to seek to impose an academic boycott on it. That is the specifically academic form of anti-Semitism, and I gather that was the focus of this gathering. These efforts rest on the view that the state of Israel was founded in a war of aggression that expelled the Arab inhabitants, that Zionism is a form of racism, that the idea of the Jewish state is an embarrassing anachronism at odds with the ideals of cosmopolitan liberal diversity, and that the resulting state is a form of apartheid. Hence, students and faculty in the United States and elsewhere who reject racism against people of color should grasp, so we are told, the intersectional connection between that hatred of peoples of color and the Zionist oppression of the Palestine Arabs. Obviously, if these statements are an accurate account of Israel's establishment and its form of government, it's not anti-Semitic to say so. Rather, as its advocates claim, it's an expression of justified moral indignation at injustice and oppression carried out by people who have, so the critics assert, failed to learn the right lessons of the Holocaust. If this is a form of anti-Semitism, and for reasons I will explain, I think it is, then it's a novel chapter of the longest hatred, whose early chapters we've heard very fine descriptions just now. This is the first time in the history of that long antagonism that those who would do harm to the Jews or despise them are doing so in the name of anti-racism. It is the claim that antagonism to the state of Israel is a form of anti-racism and anti-imperialism that more than any other factor accounts for whatever appeal it may have among activists, especially in Britain and the United States, or academics who are attempting to pass boycott resolutions of the MLA and other professional organizations. The authors of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance have, in recent years, asserted that such claims are about Israel are forms of anti-Semitism because they apply standards to Israel that are not applied to other states, and they attribute an evil power to Israel which was earlier applied, as we just heard, to the Jews. Yet, as a historian, the most important problem which the above described attacks on Israel raise is that they are wrong on the facts. Their repetition, even in a professional organization such as the Middle East Studies Association, are forms of anti-Semitism because they are not true and because they bear uncanny resemblance to the kind of lies told about Jews, first in the traditions of Antiquity, then in Christianity and in Islam, and then by secular and modern Jew haters. A very disturbing aspect of the past 2 decades is that falsehoods about Israel have been given some academic respectability, so that there are faculty and students who are convinced that repeating what I regard as falsehoods about Israel is their way of fighting against racism. It's here appropriate to recall one of Karl Marx's most brilliant and wise insights, one that he failed to apply to his own views about Jews. In his 1852 essay, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, Marx wrote that, quote, "The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare in the brains of the living. And just when they seem engaged in revolutionizing themselves and things, in creating something entirely new, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service. Our circumstances are not those of a revolutionary crisis, at least not yet. But Marx's assertion of the nightmare of past traditions applies to the realities of anti-Semitism in our time. For when those who characterize Israel as racist, aggressive, oppressive, and claim to be speaking the values of the left or even liberalism, they do so in terms that amount to updates of classic stereotypes and accusations leveled at Judaism and Jews since the story of the crucifixion in the New Testament and the tales of the prophets told in the pages of the Quran. The illusion of this academicized form of anti-Semitism is that as a secular, modern, or postmodern phenomenon, it has no connection to the religious hatreds of a less enlightened pre-modern era. The defining aspect of this, our historical moment, in the long history of anti-Semitism, is that it now simultaneously comes from 3 sources: Nazism and the racist far right, evident in the gentleman that we heard about in Tucson, the after effects of the communist and radical leftist attack on Zionism in Israel, and third, Islamist ideology and politics in both Sunni Arab and Shia Iranian forms, and in the non-Arab Muslim countries in Southwest Asia. Despite their different ideological and cultural starting points, these 3 faces of anti-Semitism share with the ancient hatred a core conspiracy theory focused on a powerful and evil Jew. This view of the Jews and then the state of Israel as powerful and evil is deeply embedded, as we have heard this afternoon, in Western culture, most of all in Christianity's New Testament and in the traditions of Catholic and Protestant churches for many centuries, as well as in the Quran, which is also a chapter, as David Nierenberg makes a very important point, as well as in the Quran, which is also a chapter in the Western tradition. Those of you who have read the Quran know that it's immersed in commentaries on especially the Old Testament. So long as the religion of Christianity and Islam exists, so long as people read the New Testament and the Quran, there will be readers somewhere who find in them abundant textual ammunition to defame and hate Judaism and the Jews. These texts can and they have been read in ways that are favorable to the Jews. Certainly Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill did so, and many others. After the Holocaust, the Catholic and Christian churches rejected the deicide accusations. Yet the sacred texts remain to be read, and there will always be some fragment of believers who take to heart their pejorative view of Judaism and the Jews. As Nierenberg has recently pointed out, anti-Judaism is a constitutive element of the Western tradition. And so what existed for 2,000 years is not going to disappear, especially in view of the canonical and central role of these key texts. So that's a historian's comment on the weight of the past. The commonality of the Christian story of the crucifixion, the Islamic narratives of the Jews who killed the prophets, and the secular conspiracy theories about international Jewry has been the attribution of enormous power with evil and murderous intent to the Jews. In reality, over the course of 2 millennia, the power relations were always precisely the reverse of what the anti-Jewish tradition asserted. That is, the reality was statelessness and powerlessness, and the ease with which Jew haters could murder or persecute Jews without suffering any harm at all. The Holocaust brought this history of non-Jewish power and Jewish power of Jewish powerlessness to a genocidal conclusion. It is against the background of this history that the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 assumes its importance as a cultural revolution within the Western tradition, a point that is not made often enough. When the Jews acquired sovereignty in a nation state like others, they brought an end to what had been normalcy of Jewish powerlessness in the Western tradition. After 1948, and for the first time in the history of the Western tradition, the Jews had the ability to defend themselves, which meant attempts to harm them became dangerous for their potential murderers. This development was a shock for anti-Semites. For them, their fiction of a nightmare of a powerful and evil Jew had become a reality in the form of the State of Israel. Now the Jews actually did pose a danger to those who wanted to kill them. The global obsession with Israel, or rather with Israel's alleged misdeeds, reflects these very deep cultural roots of Jew hatred in Western culture, whether Christian, Islamic, or secular. The novelty of the past 76 years lies precisely in the fact that Israelis are not powerless or defenseless and have entered the norm among other nations. Yet for the anti-Semitic imagination, this perfectly ordinary power instead signifies that the deep fears and hatred about the Jews have now assumed the unprecedented feature of real power and force. The idea is so common in recent decades that it is the State of Israel, which is primarily or even solely responsible for what is called the conflict, a euphemism, with the Arab states and the Palestine Arabs, and that the Arab states and the Palestine Arabs have no or minimal responsibility for the continuation of war and terror. This view emerges from long-standing, deep-seated, remarkably resilient traditions of all dead generations, which in Marx's words, weigh like a nightmare in the brains of the living, whether in the MLA or Mesa or other places. For the anti-Semite, the murderous and evil Jew of old has been reincarnated as the aggressive, racist, and imperialist Israeli, or even worse, the Israeli as Nazi. So I want to summarize these three forms. And in so doing, I'm summarizing several books that I've written. The first is The Jewish Enemy, Nazi Propaganda During World War II and the Holocaust, which I published in 2006. The core conclusion of that book is that the radical anti-Semitism of the Nazi regime, reflected in Hitler's speeches, Goebbels' essays, countless posters, propaganda messages on the radio, material given to the soldiers in the army, was that there was an international Jewish conspiracy which had seized power in the Soviet Union and in Britain and the United States, and that this was an actual political phenomenon, that it had decided to go to war against Nazi Germany, and that the purpose of this international conspiracy was to exterminate the German people, and that Hitler instead was engaged in, quote, exterminating and annihilating. Those terms, the German terms, were public, not private. Was engaged in exterminating and annihilating what he called the Jewish race in Europe before these evil and powerful Jews could exterminate the German people. So in the perspective of the Nazi regime, the Holocaust was a massive act of national self-defense, self-righteously undertaken in order to protect the Germans from genocide. The radical anti-Semitism of the Nazi regime was an interpretive framework of world politics. It explained why Britain and the United States were in an alliance with the Soviet Union, otherwise seemingly incomprehensible, and that this made no sense. Why would the Western imperialists be in an alliance with the Jewish Bolsheviks, according to Nazi language? And the reason was, of course, that an international conspiracy existed. It was the Jews that brought them together. This anti-Semitic interpretation of world affairs was public, and it was articulated by Hitler on numerous occasions in speeches that were public, that were published in the major newspapers of the entire world. It was expressed in Goebbels' public essays, and the thing I want to stress about this is how public and vivid and explicit the Nazis' threats to, not only threats to kill the Jews, but also declarations in public that they were carrying out the extermination of the Jews. So the Jews indeed were Germany's misfortune, but they were also had committed the sin of starting the Second World War. So all of the suffering and all of the death that was being endured by the German people were, according to the Nazi leaders, were due to this international conspiracy, and therefore the Jews were receiving exactly the punishment that they deserved. This sense of self-righteousness, the projection onto the Jews of exactly what the Nazis were doing to them, remained a key theme, a central theme of the radical anti-Semitism that accompanied the Holocaust, and in that sense, the term "the final solution," of course, has Christological roots. It defined Christianity as an essentially anti-Jewish and at times racist religion, and that from the vision of the powerful Jews who conspired to murder Jesus to the international Jewish conspiracy that was intent on exterminating the Germans, there is a continuity in the Western tradition of the long-term and the modern. Let's turn to Islamic anti-Semitism, and here one must be very careful about using terms properly. Christianity, and here the speeches of Churchill in particular are illustrative, but many others, as you all know, is not an inherently anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish tradition, though it would be absurd to claim that Augustine and Luther and their views on Jews have nothing to do with the New Testament and with the traditions of Christianity. These traditions can be interpreted in different ways, and they have been interpreted in different ways. And in the course of the Holocaust, a philo-Semitic interpretation of Christianity emerged among American Protestants and Catholics as well. Well, the same exact methodological, historical, interpretive frameworks that historians apply to Christianity should be applied to the history of Islam. There are long centuries of coexistence of Jews in Muslim societies without equality, but at least not with murderous persecution. Nevertheless, those of you who have read the Quran, and I think there are far too few academics or Americans in general who since 9/11 have, or before, have read the Quran. But if you read the Quran, then it is obvious that there is an abundance of pejorative comments about the Jews in that text and in commentaries that were selected by people like Osama bin Laden or Hajim al-Husseini or Said Qutb, who were not making things up when they selectively read these texts. So while the religion of Islam is not an inherently anti-Jewish religion, it can be read that way. And within the scholarship, especially in Germany, but not only, a number of historians, Matthias Kunzel, Martin Coopers, Klaus Gensicke, and then in the English-speaking world, Paul Berman, David Motadl, Robert Wistrich, and myself have all explored the ways in which Islam could be interpreted and the text can be interpreted. In other words, Islam has its Luthers. I think that's one in what used to be the home of Heiko Obermann. I think that's a phrase that I think is useful. Islam has its Luthers, its haters, its Said Qutbs, its Hajim al-Husseinis, intellectuals, and political figures who interpret the Quran as an inherently anti-Jewish, and Islam as an inherently anti-Jewish tradition. Here, Islam's key Luther type, the Martin Luther, within Islam, Hajim al-Husseini's 1937 text, Islam and the Jews, which I discuss in Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, is comparable to Martin Luther's The Jews and Their Lies, or the Catholic Church's repetition of the deicide accusation. Nazi officials became aware of Husseini's 1937 text, and he placed Jew hatred into a centuries-long time span that the Jews had despised and hated Islam from the beginning, that they had conspired to betray Muhammad, and that the state of Israel, or the Zionist project in 1937, the Zionist project and the attempt to build a Jewish state in British Mandate Palestine, was only the latest chapter in a long Islamic, in a long Jewish antagonism to the religion of Islam. In Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, which I published in 2009, I examined the collaboration of Hajim al-Husseini with the Nazi regime, which I focused on and his participation in shortwave radio propaganda, Arabic propaganda aimed at North Africa and the Middle East. During the war, Alexander Kirk, the American ambassador in Cairo, established a team of Arabic speakers and translators and technical people, and they transcribed and translated several thousand pages of the Arabic language broadcasts, which I found in the United States National Archives in 2007. So Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World contains the most extensive documentation of Islamists, of a fusion of Nazi conspiracy theories with Hajim al-Husseini and Islamist interpretation of the Quran. After the Second World War, and I'm summarizing a great deal, of course, Husseini, quote, escaped very lenient house arrest in Paris. The French government had him under house arrest for his Nazi-era collaboration. And he returned to Cairo, where he received a hero's welcome from Hassan al-Banna, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, and myself in Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, and in Matthias Kunzel's 2003 book in German, published in 2011, I think in English, as Jihad and Jew Hatred, document the great enthusiasm of the Muslim Brotherhood for Husseini's return, and viewed Husseini's return to the Middle East as an opportunity to continue the anti-Jewish war that the Nazis had fought, and therefore, and this is a very important conclusion of the work of Matthias Kunzel, of Jeffrey Herf, of David Matadl, of Klaus Gensicke, of Martin Coopers, and Klaus Michael Malmann, a mix of German and British and American historians, that the Nazis were defeated in Europe, but there was an afterlife of Nazism. And that afterlife found its most important expression in the Muslim Brotherhood, and then its offshoots, such as the Arab Higher Committee, which launched the War of 1947 and rejected the United Nations Partition Resolution and went to war. So that the War of 1948, from this perspective, far from being an example of colonialism or apartheid or racism on the part of the Zionists, is just the reverse. And it was seen that way. And this is extremely important. I make this point in a book I published this spring called Israel's Moment, International Support for and Opposition to Establishing the Jewish State. At the time, in the 1940s, in New York and Washington, the lions of the New Deal, the liberal politicians in Washington, the leftist and liberal journals in New York, the editors of The Nation, the I.F. Stone in left-leaning journals such as PM, French socialists and communists, the Soviet Union, Andrei Gromyko, Ukraine's ambassador to the United Nations, Vasyl Tarasenko, Alfred Fedorkiewicz, a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau, who was Poland's ambassador to the United Nations. All of these people saw the Zionist project as a leftist project, a liberal project, a continuation of anti-fascism. And they saw the Arab Higher Committee, whose leadership were the former Nazi collaborators, as an extremely reactionary phenomenon that simply refused to share that part of the world. Jamal Husseini, Husseini's cousin, gave a speech in London and at the United Nations in which he said he rejected the partition resolution because he believed in a homogeneity of race, and that the Arab world was a homogeneous racial region, and that the Jews were other and alien. This notion of Palestine Arab racism never enters into the discussion at the Modern Language Association or in MESA or in much of academic. The whole reactionary nature of the Arab Higher Committee and the anti-imperialist dimensions of the Zionist revolt against Britain receives almost no mention. But the realities, those were the realities. And the American Academy and the British Academy, the European Academy, hears much too little about it. Now, the third form has to do with communism, the radical left, since 1949. And that is the form of the secular left that probably has the most impact on the American and European Academy. That is where the attack on Israel as a racist and apartheid state, and to quote Vladimir Putin as Vladimir Putin's denunciation of Ukrainians as a bunch of Nazis continues the tradition of the Soviet Union of denouncing Israel as a Nazi state. In this view, Israel is a product of American imperialism and colonialism. In Israel's Moment, I point out that the United States State Department, the Pentagon, the Central Intelligence Agency, the British Foreign Office and the British military, the French Foreign Ministry, all opposed the establishment of the State of Israel because they regarded the establishment of the State of Israel as a threat to Western access to oil, and they thought that Zionism would have strong connections to the Soviet Union and communism. And to quote George F. Kennan, one of the first director of the policy planning staff in the State Department, the establishment of a Jewish state would, in his view, and the view of the Secretary of State, George Marshall, be a, quote, disaster for American national security interests. This is something that many of our colleagues are clueless about. And so it's extremely important in my view, and I'm not going to be modest about the book. it's extremely important that as many academics as possible who care about these issues read Israel's Moment, because I think it recalls a set of political realities that are either never known or forgotten, and conflict completely with the conventional notion about Israel's establishment. The Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, SSR, Poland in 1947-48 were far more important for the establishment of the Jewish state, both in terms of their diplomatic fighting, their diplomatic struggles at the United Nations, where they made common cause with Abba Eban and Moshe Shertok, the Israeli representatives, and in sending, and as far as Czechoslovakia is concerned, sending weapons to the Jews at a time when the United States and Britain were enforcing an arms embargo that became a United Nations arms embargo. This history of Soviet bloc support for the Zionist project has also been repressed and forgotten because it's embarrassing. And one of the great successes of Soviet and PLO propaganda during the Cold War, and especially since the 1960s, was to repress the memory of the era of Soviet Zionism. And then, after the fall of 1949, when Stalin changed his mind and it turned out that Israel was not going to be a Trojan horse for Soviet influence, the Soviet Union conducted a massive propaganda campaign, which I view as one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in world politics of the last century. And that propaganda campaign reversed the realities of 1947-48, presented Israel as a product of American imperialism, Zionism as a form of racism, and obscured and repressed the realities of Nazi collaboration on the part of the Arab Higher Committee. Following the Six-Day War of 1967, this distorted view of Israel's origin spread into the global New Left, and following a long march through the institutions from the 1960s onward, a generation or two or three of people received tenure who adopted this mistaken view of Israel's origins. It was what has happened is an academicization of ideas about Israel that are not the result of brilliant insights and original creative thinking within the academy. What has happened is the academicization of a propaganda campaign in world politics, famously evident in the Zionism as Racism resolution of 1975. The one distinctive feature about the secular left's anti-Zionism is that it gave antagonism to Israel an intellectual respectability that was separate from the Nazi affiliations and was separate from the religious phenomenon of the Islamist movements. And as I indicated in the beginning of my remarks, it's just a crucial and distinctive feature of this chapter and the longer history of anti-Semitism is that its advocates, many of our, and sometimes our colleagues, indignantly insist that they are not anti-Semites at all. And indeed, the accusation of anti-Semitism in their view is just a cynical form of Zionist propaganda designed to deflect, quote, legitimate criticism. They make this claim even though they attack the moral legitimacy of the state of Israel, denounce it for war crimes that it has not committed, and make excuses or make light of the terrorism waged against Israel. They claim they make these accusations because they oppose racism, and those who describe their anti-racism as a form of anti-Semitism as I said, engaging in insidious Zionist propaganda. The accusation of anti-Semitism in their view confirms the truth of their assertions that Zionism was a form of racism and the resulting state of Israel is an apartheid state that should be abolished by force of arms if necessary. In the American context, the claim by Angela Davis and leaders of the Black Lives Matter organization that there is an intersectional connection between racism in the United States toward people of color and with Israel's policies toward the Palestine Arabs lends weight to the view that those who are opposed to racism in the United States must also seek to bring an end to the state of Israel. And this is a very, very difficult argument for American undergraduates at the age of 18, 19, 20, 21 to counter. I conclude. I want to turn our attention to the issue of truth and facts versus falsehoods and lies. And I'm repeating what I said at the outset. If the state of Israel fits the description of its enemies, if it was founded in sins of aggression, if racist principles and practices are its foundation, and if it alone is responsible for 70 years of war and conflict, then it would be right and just and would not be evidence of anti-Semitism to say so. It would be right and just to say so, even if critics kept silent about the sins of many other states that were even worse practitioners of such evils. Hypocrisy alone would not discredit Israel's enemies. Such double standards and an inordinate preoccupation with the sins of the Jewish state would be a reminder of anti-Semitism's cultural persistence, but the existence of hypocrisies and double standards applied to Israel would not demonstrate that its enemies were mistaken. I make these points because in recent years, a great deal of effort has been devoted to establishing a definition of anti-Semitism that asserts that describing the state of Israel as racist, apartheid, and a settler colonial state is a form of anti-Semitism. Scholarship on contemporary anti-Semitism has no difficulty finding numerous examples inside and outside the academy of faculty and advocates who make such assertions. The discussion is taking place in an atmosphere of post-truth, one of cynicism about the possibility of distinguishing between truth and lies. This cynicism is not only a problem of anti-Semitism, this cynicism is fatal to the existence of the academy and the university. As this cynicism spreads, the idea that anyone is telling the truth about anything, not only about Israel or about questions about anti-Semitism, appears to be a childish illusion or something for suckers. Adulthood and sophistication apparently lead to the conclusion that everyone is a liar, and professors are especially good at lying because we have a larger vocabulary and know how to place rhetoric in the service of our lives. If that is the case, that's certainly the message of Donald Trump. If that is the case, there is no reason for the existence of universities, and certainly not for the existence of my beloved profession of the discipline of history. So in 2022, we need to do what U.S. Ambassador Daniel Patrick Moynihan did in 1975, when he denounced the Zionism as racism resolution. Some of you will recall that he rejected that resolution because it rested on a falsehood. It was not true, he said, that Zionism was a form of racism. To insist that it was, in the face of overwhelming evidence that it wasn't, raises the issue of why so many were willing to believe lies about the Jewish state. It was this willingness to believe in a lie that found the new linked the new anti-Semitism to the old, because the old anti-Semitism at its core had rested on lies about the Jews since the writing of the Christian Gospels and later the Quran. The belief that a democracy born of a war against colonialism, inspired by rejection of all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, and that repeatedly offered a compromised territorial solution to the Palestine Arabs, this was instead a monstrous form of colonialism and racism, reversed the actual reality. It is a form of anti-Semitism because it repeats lies about the Jews and the Jewish state, and it fits Marx's example of the traditions of the past that weigh like nightmares in contemporary brains. Challenging falsehoods and lies about Israel should assume a greater place in discussion of the academy. We need to clearly state that BDS resolutions and assertions about Israel as an apartheid state are forms of anti-Semitism because they are factually incorrect. The connection between lies and anti-Semitism has been crucial to its entire history. The Jews did not crucify Jesus. An international Jewish conspiracy intent on exterminating the Germans never existed. The Holocaust happened, and it's a lie to have asserted that the state of Israel invented this hoax to extort money from the German government. The Soviet Union and the global left did support the establishment of the Jewish state. The State Department and the British Foreign Office did not. The scholarship of cultural intellectual historians remind us of the many centuries in which culture shaped by Christianity, Islam, and secular modernity believed lies about Jews. The weight of this history explains the inclination to believe lies that assert that Israel is distinctly powerful, evil, and murderous. Russia's Vladimir Putin emerged from the Soviet Union's secret services. Part of their expertise lay in telling lies about Israel, especially that the Israelis behave exactly like the Nazis. The Israeli as Nazi became a frequent theme of the Soviet bloc, and it distorted the global leftist redefinition, and its distorted global leftist redefinition of anti-fascism. It was one of the consequential and most successful lies of Soviet and radical propaganda of the Cold War. And when Putin launched his war of extermination against Ukraine, he updated the false Nazi accusation and applied it to the Ukrainians. Having observed how effective it was in fanning antagonism to the Jewish state, he may have concluded that it would be equally effective in defaming Ukraine. Probably most of the Academy recognizes Putin's lies about Ukraine. A successful fight against anti-Semitism in 2022 requires that our colleagues and our students recognize the lies told by Israel's enemies. Finding and telling the truth is the work of historians and of all scholars. Telling and finding the truth about Israel, and thus challenging lies and falsehoods about it, should move to the center of the contemporary fight against anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Herf. Thank you all for listening. I know it's been a long series of presentations, so I'm now happy to open this up to questions from the floors, the virtual floor and the physical floor here in the Marshall Building of the university. Yeah.
This one's from the chat. What is the analysis of why Luther grew increasingly anti-Semitic with time?
Yeah, the question was posed by someone who's observing online. What is the explanation for Luther's transition over the years to a more hostile attitude toward the Jews? Since I was the one to refer to Luther, I think I'll take on that one with your permission.
So please do.
The argument has been put forward that, most notably by Heiko Obermann, who founded the university's Division for Late Medieval Reformation Studies, that Luther expected the end of times to occur during his lifetime. And that when that did not occur, when the end of time was not realized, that he grew frustrated, and then he turned his anxiety and his sense of disappointment toward the Jews as scapegoats. I'm not a partisan of that particular interpretation. I think already embedded in Luther's early diatribes, there was a great deal of anti-Jewish animus. It may not have been as explicitly vituperative as the animus that Luther expressed in his tract on the Jews and their lies, which was a later work. However, I think the understanding of Jews as figural entities that exist primarily in order to justify Luther's own understanding of the world, that was certainly there from the very beginning. So the condescension, the sense of Jews having been superseded because they somehow do not understand the content of their own scriptures, all of these canards were very much present from the beginning. So I would question the very notion that somehow the young Luther was, I don't know, friendly or friendly-ish to Jews, while the old Luther was, I don't know, was grumpy because presumably old people like me are grumpy. I don't buy it.
May I add to that?
Yes, please.
I find it a very interesting, difficult topic, because I think we have to keep in mind also that Luther was very Augustinian. He was an Augustinian monk, and he had learned deeply Augustinian teachings. And Augustine had actually formulated, that comes from Jeremy Cohen, actually, his observation, keep the Jews alive, protect them, because we need them as the letter of the law. That was Augustinian teaching. They are blind, they're stupid, malicious, whatever, but we need them because they confirm the validity of the Old Testament. So Luther comes out of that tradition. So it is a very interesting observation that in his one of his earlier treatises, I think I referred to that as well, he actually replicates many of these judgments, saying, yeah, Jews are blind, but maybe we can teach them. And as you said, right, I totally agree with you, Luther also became frustrated because his teachings did not result radically and quickly into the apocalyptic transformation. And so I think I agree with you with a slight difference. I think he hit or had not fully formulated that hatred. And so he tried still for a long time to go the Augustinian route. And since that did not work, there was a very radical and very sharp switch from one treatise that he published in 1521 to the next treatises starting 1523, 24, where he suddenly becomes, I would say, really anti-Semitic. I agree with you, the seed was there, but he hadn't fully developed that. Tried early, he was young, he was uncertain yet maybe about his own position, so he tried to kind of be integrative, but that didn't work for him, and hence he just pursued the old route.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that, Albrecht. I take your modification of my interpretation very, very well. There's another question in the chat section. A viewer asks how it is that anti-Semitic notions have become so widespread on college campuses. So perhaps Professor Herf and Professor Kovach, you care to tackle that one?
Well, here I would just repeat what I just said, that the conference is about anti-Semitism in the academy, and the predominant, and here there is this argument about definitions of anti-Semitism, and the argument that I made, and I'll summarize it again, is that to claim that Israel is an apartheid and racist and colonial state is the predominant form of academic anti-Semitism. And the reason that I say that is because those statements about the history of Israel and its nature are false. And for 2,000 years, anti-Judaism and then anti-Semitism rests on statements about the Jews that are false. And to keep repeating falsehoods about a particular group of people is a deep habit in Western culture. And the illusion of many of our colleagues is that they're all so hip and they're all so sophisticated that they're beyond all this, that they have nothing to do with any of that they have nothing at all to do with what the three of you spoke about in the first part of our session. That's completely, that's all nonsense and ridiculous. This is all about Edward Said and Orientalism and anti-racism, and if you're opposed to police killings in Ferguson, then you must be denouncing the Mossad. That's, and if you're against racism in the United States, then of course you must be against the state of Israel. That is that secular leftist, the definition antagonism to Israel since the 1960s became a definitional, a core element of what it meant to be a radical leftist around the world. And in politics, in real politics, not in universities first, but first in real politics. And it's the academicization of those ideas, those false ideas, that is the reason why you have literature professors who are proclaiming about the history of the Middle East as if they know something about the War of 1940, or as if it's their expertise. It's ridiculous. Now, the Middle East Studies profession raises a delicate issue. If you want to do research in Egypt, or you want to do research in, well, nobody does research in Iraq or Iran now, but you need access. And that raises the question of why are so many people who work on the Middle East so hostile to Israel? The only, for many of these years, democracy in the region, a place where there is equality for women and tolerance and equality for gay people, and why? And there is a certain practical dimension to it, which is that people then adapt themselves to what has been the popular sentiments in those societies. But the race issue and the misunderstanding of the race issue is, I think, key to explaining why it has become important. I would point out, by the way, that in the American historical profession, where historians can't make up facts. You know, this is not Twitter or Facebook or social media or, you know, whatever. It's neither Fox or MSNBC. I don't mean to insult anybody, but we make this claim to try to establish the truth about what happened in the past. We're not infallible. We make mistakes, but that's the goal. And those boycott resolutions kept being defeated in the American Historical Association because people said they're not true. It's not, you know, some people got up and said, this is a form of anti-Semitism. And there were some people who voted on that basis. But the great majority of the votes against those resolutions were cast by people who simply said, I don't believe what they're saying about Israel is true. And that at that point about the importance of truth and falsehood, and is one that that won the day so far, at any rate, in the American Historical Association. Sorry for the long answer, but I'll give shorter answers.
Perfectly fine. No, Tom, go ahead.
I just want to add a little bit there. I think we can agree that for many in the academy today, anti-Israel sentiment is a kind of cover for old-fashioned anti-Semitism. I think that certainly is a phenomenon that exists. But on the other hand, it has to be said, we all know that many Israelis and many Jews throughout the world feel very critical of the policies of the current Israeli government, and not just current, but going back quite a few years. So I guess the question for all of us is, where do we draw the line between legitimate criticism of the state of Israel's policies and the kind of radical denunciations that we hear from so many in the academy? And that's a question that I think really needs to be addressed.
I don't think it's a difficult question to answer. That nobody who opposes the BDS resolution, certainly not myself, has ever said that the Israeli government should be beyond criticism. This is just a non-issue. what we're facing in recent years are efforts to boycott the state of Israel, to describe it as a racist government, to reject its moral legitimacy, and to make the intellectual argument or the ideological argument that it should not exist. So it would be because the United States has a high crime rate and the too many people in prison, it shouldn't exist, you know, or whatever problem. There are too many guns, or crazy people saying the election was stolen. The United States just is immoral and illegitimate. It should go away. You know? Every government has problems. The line that you, the question of drawing the line, where does one draw the line? One draws the line at suggestions that the United States should break its alliance with Israel, that the state of Israel is unworthy of existing, that it should be replaced, if necessary, by force of arms. I don't think that's a difficult line to draw. And that to me is a form of anti-Semitism.
I'm tempted to continue along those lines, but I'm wondering if anybody here has a question or a comment that they would like to issue. Okay. Well, go ahead, Albrecht.
I would like to pick up somewhere, actually, David, where you left us. Maybe also in light of the latest recent comments, which I totally agree with, by the way. Replacing Israel, well, with what? So I think you mentioned something very interesting point, the Spanish king crown and society insisted on the limpieza de sangre. And well, whether they achieved it or not, it's very messy history anyway. But I think that plays well into the current situation we are facing today, which might really explain much about anti-Semitism, because we live today in a very global world, very multicultural world, where limpieza de sangre is no longer possible. Maybe we should never even aim for. But I think there are a lot of people in our society that spills over into the academy who kind of dream of this limpieza de sangre, white Christian male. And so since it's not so popular maybe to express that in public, maybe to repress women, so I think there's a very strong tendency to resort to something which is easier, blame the Jews. So since they cannot achieve their Christian patriotic world of monoculture, they're looking for another scapegoat. And that's then, I think, one of the very infernal, nefarious strategies to voice these opinions against Israel, which is not discriminatory, it is collective and ultimately, you know, a lie. Would you agree? I mean, it's
I'm going to click on the, okay. I see a couple of contributions to the chat, so let me try to scan them quickly and see if I can reproduce them for the benefit of the panelists. Okay, this this audience member wonders whether the growth of anti-Semitism in the academy can in some sense be understood as a corollary to the notion of equity, namely the notion that demographic disparities are somehow leveled by, that are unjust. Put differently, that underrepresentation is necessarily and per se a result of injustice and racism. Does it not follow as a corollary that overrepresentation is also per se unjust, and further, that the overrepresented group has improperly taken spots from the underrepresented group? I presume that by overrepresented group, the questioner may be thinking of Jews as a category. So might, quote, and I continue to read, so might anti-Semitism follow as a corollary from what may be overstated equations of demographic disparities with injustice? I don't know.
Good for the questioner.
Yeah.
Courageous person. The the question that looms over this discussion, one question in my view, is whether we are at the beginning of a new era of discrimination against Jews in the universities, with the use of terms like underrepresented and overrepresented categories. Jews in the academy since World War II are, quote, overrepresented. There's a higher percentage of Jews in the academy than there are Jews in the American population. And the more that we use terms like underrepresented and overrepresented, the more there will be political pressure to see to it that the nature of the faculty is an accurate representation of the demographics of the American population. In other words, that we displace merit regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, with race, gender, and ethnicity. This is the norm in many countries around the world. This is not unusual around the world. I am very worried about a young generation of Jews who are thinking of entering the academy. Indeed, the whole discussion of anti-Semitism is sometimes described as a demand for white privilege. After all, Jews are white. What's the problem? Racism is not about anti-Semitism. Racism is about people of color. So we're dealing with very serious, very, very serious issues. And it may be that the last 50, 60 years are the high point of American Jewish accomplishment in the academy, and that this kind of language about overrepresentation and underrepresentation will serve to make it more difficult for people to be evaluated on the basis of merit. Indeed, the word merit may become under assault as itself being some sort of justification of white supremacy. So these are questions that I don't have the answer for, but the concerns about this kind of language, and I say that, by the way, as a liberal. Those of you who know what I've published about Donald Trump and the Republican Party know that I'm a fierce opponent of Trumpism and the Republican Party in its current form. I say, and I defend those liberal principles, which are under attack, obviously from the right, but they also come under attack from some of the language of equity and diversity. So it's a delicate issue, but it's important to raise it. So I thank the questioner.
Very well. There's another question. I'm just going to read this. I don't know whether it makes sense. The causes of the growth of anti-Semitism in the academy. Okay, no, I think this is the same question as before. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, let me therefore follow up on what you've just said, Professor Herf, and address Tom Kovach's earlier very important question. Where does one draw the line? If I've heard you correctly, Professor Herf, one line may be drawn according to a simple criterion of factual accuracy. In other words, accusations and, let's say, hostility that is directed against Israel and, let's say, against Jewish self-determination writ large, that are based on factually incorrect or exaggerated or distorted conceptions, assertions, etc., are categorically liable to fall into the anti-Semitic rabbit hole, particularly those which generalize from specific instances. Another aspect that I thought I might comment on is the following. The focus on truth and and falsehood is, I think, very apposite, of course, for historians. You mentioned, Professor Herf, that the American Historical Association has rejected calls for BDS, while, for example, the MLA, the American Indian Studies Association, certain Asian Studies Associations, and other organizations have at least entertained BDS resolutions, if not actually approved them. I'm wondering whether you think that the conformist trend toward sort of moralistic denunciations of Zionism is part of a larger phenomenon whereby facticity itself is treated as somehow suspect. Where, for example, it is only texts, quote unquote, texts that exist in culture and not their factual contexts. And that therefore what matters is not whether a particular claim is factually accurate or demonstrable, but rather whether it is pre-approved, you might say, as morally and politically virtuous. And if it is morally and politically virtuous, according to some, let's say, caucus of faculty members, then facticity goes out the window. And what one has to do is essentially conform and show one's bona fides by saying, yes, indeed, Jews kill Christ, or Zionism is racism, or pick your slogan.
Well, I'm gonna address you as David, and you please address me as Jeffrey. When Donald Trump began to denounce fake news, it was obvious that while he had never read Jacques Derrida and wouldn't know the difference between postmodernism and Albert Einstein, that the cynicism about truth that had accompanied postmodernism in the academy was now American popular culture and American politics. So if one is a consistent postmodernist and denounces historians for thinking that they can do more than just juxtapose one narrative as opposed to another, then why should one believe that police mistreat Black people? Why should one believe that slavery was also terrible? Why should one believe that Hispanics are mistreated, or that women have had it bad, or that gays are persecuted? Why should one believe any of that if it's all just a bunch of narratives? Gertrude Himmelfarb 25 years ago pointed this out. Oh, neoconservative nonsense, it's not true. And then it came to be the case that the very cynicism about truth that was supposed to be so hip and so radical and so subversive of the white, male-dominant, heterosexist, imperialist, racist ruling class was now being turned against Black activists, gays, women, Hispanics, and other subordinate groups. And that is now something that millions and millions of our fellow citizens believe very deeply. And so what goes around has come around, and people were warned, but they said, "Oh, we know better." Well, they didn't know better. So, what is going to happen to the possibility? I mean, look at the attacks on schools coming from the right wing, but all these professors who were trying to, these pedophiles who were trying to groom kids and tell them stories. We need to establish that there is such a thing, are facts and truth, and that as old-fashioned and as unsophisticated as it may sound to many people, especially in English departments, but not only, that there are such things as facts and truths. There was when Saul Friedlander, the historian of the Holocaust, had a seminar at a conference in Los Angeles in the 1990s, and he invited Hayden White, which many of you are familiar with Hayden White's work on postmodernism, and White had written about historians write fictions and narratives and all that. And at the conference, Martin Jay, who's a intellectual historian then at Berkeley, Marty J said to Hayden White, well, Hayden, did the Holocaust happen or didn't it? And White said, well, of course it happened. Of course it happened. Everybody knows it happened. Oh, really? Really? How'd you know that? Isn't it just this Zionist narrative? At some point, everybody becomes a positivist, an unsophisticated positivist, and they say, the sun is shining, it's day. The moon is out, and it's night. And I know it, right? And
Is it perhaps the case that many of our colleagues are becoming highly selective positivists? In other words, the sun is shining as long as I find it shining at a particular time for me to be aesthetically or politically advantageous, pleasant, politically wise, and so forth. But it is not shining for the people I consider to be morally, politically wrong.
If I may add.
Sure.
I don't know. I'd be interested to know what you people think. What you fellas think.
I like to continue with that thought because there is indeed this very multiplicity of voices and there is no more truth. Everything is narration. But when it comes to Israel, there are suddenly facts. In other words, there are two different discourses. Everything is just narration and narrative. But when it comes to the evil deeds by Jews in general, they are suddenly positivists. Suddenly, there's a completely different set of categories. And that's where the discussion.
It's a positivism that peddles lies.
Exactly.
In other words, it's a counter narrative. It's an anti-positivist positivism, if you will. That people make their lives confusing is not a surprise, but it's less daunting. Okay, listen. Any questions from our friends here? I don't see any others. Oh, let me see. One from the chat. No, this is old. Please bear with me.
I would like to share a little anecdote. It goes back at least about 30, 40 years ago. And I talked with sort of a relative who had lived through the 30s. And we happened to talk a little bit about the Holocaust. And she just burst forth. Yeah, all the big insurances, all the banks, and all the rich people, they're all Jews. They deserved it.
Yeah. Well, look, if I were as powerful as people say Jews are, then I would be making a lot more money, and I wouldn't have the problems that I have today with Zoom. A viewer asks, what steps can pro-Israel students take to defend their opinions in classrooms, etc., so that their opinions aren't immediately shunned and so that they don't feel attacked by a mass of pro-Palestine students? I've seen so much footage of professors and pro-Palestine campus groups shunning and completely excluding pro-Israel students in discussions. So that is the question. I have the impulse to answer, but perhaps my fellow panelists would like to chime in.
What's been your experience at the University of Arizona?
My experience is that Arizona is a quiet place. Some scholars do swallow, as a matter of course, half-digested facts, counterfactual notions concerning Israel and Zionism. You used the term old-fashioned or unsophisticated earlier. I think in at least as far as the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies is concerned, we try to be as empirical as we can. Our job is not to defend or to impugn anybody who holds any particular political position, but simply to model the proper pursuit of truth, which ultimately is while not devoid of bias, should at least strive to minimize bias and to appeal to disciplinary standards that allow people of very different backgrounds and very different ideologies to correspond and to agree on what is certain and what is not.
I think it's important for university presidents, deans, and provosts to set a tone and to make clear that the university exists for open and free debate, and that this does not involve insulting or intimidating people you disagree with. And if that's not there, then the people who yell the loudest or the most insulting get their way.
Yeah.
It I've done everything that I can as a historian, and I know this sounds a little bit self-serving, but the questioner asked, what can students do? And they can be good students. They can read our books. You know, I mean, we don't write these books so that nobody reads them.
Yeah.
Many of the people who say these things simply don't know what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the best way to respond to them is to be more well informed.
Right. Yeah, the solutions in a sense are simple. Read, think, discuss. Go ahead, Albrecht.
I would like to pick up a little bit what Jeffrey, what you said, which I found really important for me at least. The anti-Semitism we observe today is often focusing over and over again on Israel. I mean, that's sort of the linchpin, and then they just draw all kinds of consequences. But you rightly said, please give me a government that is innocent. I mean, yes, we all know the Israeli government has had lots of problems. Benjamin Netanyahu is even under investigations. He might be even thrown to prison, whatever. No government is simply innocent and pure. But they just use and reveal them, like Luther in a way, that they have an inherent sentiment which they use then suddenly to justify stereotypes. So I think if we insist that anti-Semitism is not, or that we should fight for liberal open-mindedness, not because we defend Israel, but we defend the equality of all people in this country. I think that's a very important statement. So I really learned something from you. That's a good argument. Thank you.
Thank you. I would add that dealing with BDS, or I mean, in the universities, it's important for students and faculty to understand that this is part of a political campaign connected to the Palestine Authority. This is not just, innocent academic, playing around. This is serious business. This is an effort to try to win ideological and intellectual battles in Europe, including Britain and the United States, at a time when the Palestine Authority has lost its battles at home. And the alternative to waging these kind of campaigns and leading to the Amnesty International report is to simply say, yes, we want to have a Palestinian state, and we want to live side by side with the state of Israel. And the other thing that needs to receive more attention is Israel's growing integration into the Arab Middle East. That there are Arab states that, partly because they're very concerned about Iran, partly because they find Israel attractive for economic reasons, that have made peace with Israel. That in effect, that the old Arabs versus the Israel is that expression, there's Israel and the Arabs, that doesn't exist anymore. There are Arabs who actually view the existence of the state of Israel as a boon to the Arab Middle East, as a benefit. And the race question, I didn't mention this, perhaps several of you would like to comment. Many of the citizens of Israel who are Jews, came from North Africa and the Middle East, don't look white. They're fairly dark skinned or brown skinned or whatever. They're not and this fact that Israel is already a multiracial society, or that Jews come in various colors, and that the Palestine Arabs, the Palestinians, look very much like a lot of the Israelis. There's no physical difference. There's not some dramatic racial distinction. Einat Wilf has made this point in a number of her essays. That's also something that gets lost on discussions about race and intersectionality on American campuses.
We are virtually at an end time-wise, so I'm going to call for a conclusion, and thank you all for your patience, and of course, both of you online, for my colleagues, for your contributions. I would hate to have anybody come away with the impression that this conference is somehow intended to defend or attack Israel. That is not the purpose of this panel. The purpose is to explore the ways in which people internalize and deploy pernicious falsehoods as a matter of social, political, cultural animus. As I said before, and I think Albrecht mentioned also, we are not here to argue for or against BDS. You could probably guess our positions or individual positions, but those are simply the positions of private citizens here at the University of Arizona, not opinions leveled in our capacity as instructors and as professionals. Albrecht, do you want to say a few words?
I would like to say, my personal experience has actually been very positive. As far as I can remember, in none of my classes, in none of my committee works, or any other activities here on this campus have I ever really experienced traumatic situations. But that's not the point to warn us against something imaginary. We know that the problem exists, at least in this country, in other countries as well, in Germany, for example. But I think the point here was, and I thank our other panelists very much, to prepare ourselves intellectually, to think it through, and to make it to an academic discussion where we are aware about the issues, the polarities, the various positions, and know the historical roots, and can from here on move forward better prepared to handle potential issues, better to nip it in the bud than to fix the problem later. So I'm extremely grateful, first of all, to AEN to allow us doing this. I thank Jeff very much for zooming in from the East Coast. Tom Kovach, I really appreciate that you were with us so much. I would like also to extend a thank you to Max Stausfeld, who could not be part of it. He was our fourth panelist at however, that accident. So unfortunately, we could not have Max with us. Thank you very much, David, for this wonderful collaboration. For me, it's a wonderful sign forward that we already know thereby here are links, and these links deserve to be promoted further. And I also thank the audience very much, and Martha for her help, and Glory for her help. There has been a lot of support in the background, and whether they hear this right now or not. I also would like to thank the audience. I think we had about 31 people altogether. This is a great sign. There's a great interest, and I'm very thankful for all of that. I feel in an academic, really in a good world. Otherwise, we would not have had this. This is a good sign. It's a good shot. Thank you, David, for your wonderful collegiality. Thank you.
All right, I will leave you all. So thank you again. We will be in touch. Good night.
Yeah.